Well, thank you very much, Liz, for that warm introduction. As Dr. Coombs mentioned, we have known each other for many, many years, and that has been a really great relationship that we've had in terms of furthering the interests of the people of New South Wales. So thank you very much for that warm introduction. Can I also extend my thanks to Affinity? I have an enormously high view of Affinity and of the work that it does. With ever-increasing tensions, not only globally but within Australia, it is important that we have avenues, vehicles, organisations and people talking to one another, understanding one another and just coming together in our common humanity. And Affinity is a great organisation for doing that. So can I give my thanks and compliments to Affinity. May I also, in commencing, pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. It is important that we recognise the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. Well, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, ladies and gentlemen, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is Australia's largest, most significant reform since Medibank, Medicare, was introduced quite some decades ago. And what I'd like to talk about today, if we can go to the next slide, just so that you have the sequence of what I'll talk about. Firstly, just to describe briefly what the NDIS is about. Three things you probably don't know about the NDIS, and then some contrasts there which are very significant. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme is to be a national scheme that is focused on the needs of people with disability and the broader community. The original agreement was signed by then Prime Minister Gillard and then Premier O'Farrell on the 6th of December 2012, and that agreement was expanded and fully ratified by current Prime Minister Turnbull and Premier Baird on the 16th of September 2015. It will ensure that 140,000 people with disability in New South Wales receive the full and necessary supports that are appropriate for their circumstances, and 460,000 people right across Australia. It is significant for at least two principal reasons. The first is that it is person-centred. At the moment we have a scheme which is government block funded. So governments provide money to organisations and those organisations provide services to people with disability. That model is turned on its head, so that under the new scheme, the National Disability Insurance Agency will provide funding directly to individuals, and those individuals will demand whatever services they want, whenever, wherever and however they want them. So for the first time, Australia will have a disability system which is genuinely focused on and driven by people with disability themselves. And that is a seminal movement, a seminal movement. The second big distinguishing characteristic of this reform is that the amount of funding increases substantially. In New South Wales' case, it moves from about $3 billion presently to full scheme in 2018-19 and following to about $6.4 billion. So again, for the first time, we will have a scheme focused on the needs of people with disability, which is fully and properly funded. And it's not a top-down cap system. It is actually generated by each individual with disability having individual assessments, necessary and sufficient supports, and reviewed annually. So this is a genuinely bottom-up driven system which will genuinely cater for those needs. And again, for the first time, because people with disability are right at the centre of this system, those scheme participants will be able to exercise full choice and control over the supports and services which they are receiving. It will be genuinely person-centred. So that's the snapshot of the National Disability Insurance Scheme that we are moving into. There are three, indeed there are more than three, but there are at least three key elements which are not widely appreciated that will flow from the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The first of those is with regard to its economic stimulus. Its economic impact is very, very significant. You will have noticed just in the figures I've quoted already that our current funding for disability services in New South Wales is just over $3 billion, about $3.1 billion. Under full scheme, the Commonwealth Government then complements that amount of money, and so it more than doubles under full scheme to $6.4 billion. Australia-wide under full scheme, that amounts to about $22 billion per annum. This will have a significant economic stimulus effect for Australia. That stimulus effect, not just from, may I add, not just from the increased government spending, but indeed from the flow-on effects which will happen from that and from a number of other impacts that individuals will be driving the system. But the effect of that will be a net increase, as projected by the Productivity Commission itself, of approximately 1%. That is an enormous impact that will come from the NDIS, a positive impact for Australia which goes beyond the mere expenditure of government dollars. The second thing that is not really widely recognised is its impact on employment. Now obviously there will be part of that impact, okay, there are more dollars, that gives capacity for more people to be employed, and indeed the projections are that they will be employed. In New South Wales, the projection is that 25,000 additional people will need to be employed come full scheme. And that means no one's allowed to retire. So that's a net additional number. That is a big increase just in New South Wales. The number is about 80,000 across Australia. That's a big employment impact. But what a lot of people also miss is that because there is early intervention in the lives of people with disability themselves will also be much more participating in the scheme and in economic life than is currently the case. The third impact is, it's a bit more general, and the word reform is a little bit overworked these days, and people talk about generally there being reform fatigue and so on. But this really is a fundamental and very substantial reform that Australia is undertaking. As I said, this is a generational level reform which we have not seen the like of since at least Medicare. The system improvement of focusing on people with disability themselves, the fact that they will be driving the system, they'll be driving innovation as part of that process, and it means governments, instead of actually handing money to organisations and them delivering services which they might think are best to people with disability, because people with disability will themselves be driving that, not only will you have that innovation happening, but it means governments and those service providing organisations will have to be much more responsive to the needs of people with disability. And that is what genuine reform is about. Reform shouldn't be about someone having a wonderful idea and think, oh yes, let's go ahead and implement this great new reform. No, good reform is actually about responding to the genuine needs of people. And the best way to do that is to have those individuals actually driving that reform. And that's what NDIS does. So the reform dimensions of NDIS are genuinely significant. I'd like now to make 2 points of contrast. The first of those is that the NDIS is not a 1950s model of welfare. The classic model of welfare is about safety net, it's about government helping those who have some need but that's constrained and so on and so on. The NDIS is profoundly different to that. It is actually not about so much providing a safety net as making an investment in the lives of people with disability to enable and empower those people to be full and contributing members of our whole community. People who are contributing and participating. And do you know what's significant about that? If people with disability, as is so often the case at the moment, are not participating to the full, it's not only people with disability who miss out, it's actually us, the rest of the community, who also miss out. People with disability have the wide range of creativity and ideas and contributions to make that every human being has. And if we don't have a participatory and inclusive community, then we are all the losers for that. And that is profoundly different from the safety net, one-size-fits-all idea of welfare, which is so readily embedded in our thinking and which so easily people will slip the NDIS into. It is very, very different to that old model. The second contrast I want now to have a look at is to look at this question of, can Australia afford the NDIS? We will hear comments that government spending is under great pressure. And yes, it is. And we will hear some calls saying, okay, various programs need to be cut or curtailed and so on. And again, they can be appropriately looked at in their time and place. But when we look at the NDIS, because it is a profoundly different type of reform, calls to either cap or ration the NDIS actually will have a very perverse outcome. And that perverse outcome is, if you try and save money in the NDIS by capping or rationing, you actually balloon costs out and you end up with worse outcomes. If we can move to the next slide, thank you. This is the one slide, the one graph that I use just about everywhere, and let me explain it to you, because this graph is very significant in terms of understanding what are the drivers for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. If you look first at the strong red line, that's the do-nothing line. That's the do-nothing line. If New South Wales or Australia had said, okay, we're not going to proactively spend money on people with disability and so on, we'll see if we'll just try and fudge things and we'll just do the barest minimum necessary. The red line describes what happens. If you try and do nothing, the cost to government escalates extraordinarily, almost exponentially in this case. Because we live in a civilised society, the minimum that we can get away with when we try and do nothing escalates essentially out of control. New South Wales was aware of this danger some years ago and instituted a number of programs, Stronger Together 2, Ready Together, and said, we have got to stop this looming disaster. And so the way to help that is to make some early investment in people with disability. And so by making that early investment, which is the yellow line, you can see that early investment in people with disability actually brings down the red line very significantly. It pays significant dividends. But states didn't have enough money to make the full investment, didn't have enough finance to actually do what clearly needed to be done, and that's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And so you can see there the dark line. That's where there is full, proper and sufficient investment. And that shows if you actually make that investment well and wisely and early, then you actually get an outcome which is financially sustainable. But don't forget, whilst this is good government finance, it is significant because it also happens to be the very best thing, the most appropriate thing for people with disability. So this is a good outcome from actually doing the right thing. And isn't that what good reform should always be about? Isn't that the sort of reform we should be searching for? But what this graph shows you is if you try and cap and ration the black line, you move back to either the yellow line or the red line. If you do not do your early investment, you end up blowing your costs out later on. And so that's why we as Australians need to be so careful about those issues. We need to make sure that the integrity of the National Disability Insurance Scheme actually is maintained because it is vital. And why would you expect that to be the case? Why would you expect to have such good outcomes here? Well, because when people with disability are full and participating members of the wider community, not only are they participating socially, but their ability to participate economically is also enhanced. Early intervention means that a greater number of people with disability are able now to participate fully or to a greater extent in the economy. So instead of being recipients of larger amounts of taxpayers' funding, they are recipients either of none or less, or become taxpayers. A very good friend of mine, who has given me permission to use his example, chairman of the New South Wales Disability Council. He has cerebral palsy. When he was a young child, his parents were advised to put him in an institution and leave him there. Had that been the case, he would have been in disability specialist support all of his life, costing governments tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars and over a lifetime even more amounts of money. His lifestyle and quality of life would have been substantially poorer. What is he doing today? He's a senior executive in a major ASX listed company, paying lots of tax dollars. So for taxpayers it's a good thing, but it's a great thing for him personally. He's had a much better outcome. And why should that be restricted to just one person whose parents happen to make a good decision? Why should that not be an opportunity for all Australians, for all people with disability? And that's what this is about. But not only will people with disability be re-entering and entering the workforce, think also of their carers. Those carers will now also be able to be freed up and to either do that on a proper basis or themselves to be full members of the workforce. And so again, you get a significant dividend. That is good for them, their choices are expanded, and also good for the economy and also good for the broader Australian society. Without that early investment, without that early intervention, the cost of governments would be potentially $45 billion by 2035. The outcomes are significantly better and in dimensions that we hear sadly too little about. If we can progress to the next. So I'd like now just to conclude with saying some more general comments, but for me what are really at the heart and passion of what the NDIS is about. And this is about Australia as a more inclusive community, a more inclusive nation. Seeing people with disability as full members of our community is vital to our future. Not only is it an economic dimension, but it's a community dimension, it's a social dimension. It's something that is very, very deeply inclusive. New South Wales has a richly diverse population. As everyone here will know, 26% of our population was born overseas, 213 languages other than English are spoken, at least 1 in 5 people speak a language other than English at home. These are just different elements of the diversity we have in Australia. And in recognising that diversity, New South Wales has made some significant investments. There's a $2 million program establishing a market development fund specifically for the multicultural sector. Nearly $500,000 to deliver a people, culture and communication project. $250,000 for a called consumer capacity building project. Another $250,000 working with ethnic people with a disability project specifically so that we can actually be more inclusive in this area. A range of people who are called community connectors, whose role is actually to connect different parts of our community. And one of our really great projects is the Ability Links project, which I was involved with even before I was appointed to my current role here. And that project is precisely to connect people with disability with all the different community organisations. And it's also for people with disability who don't need the NDIS. It's for people who might have just the most minor issue that really doesn't need further support other than, you know, their life would be fuller or richer or better connected if they just knew about this club or that organisation or this group or some other part of our community. And so the Ability Links people, which is and they've turned into a fantastic group of people, I'd have to say. It is really, really encouraging to see the work that they do. And New South Wales, and Liz made reference to it. Just last year, New South Wales introduced the Disability Inclusion Act. The legislation it replaced was my legislation called the Disability Services Act. And it's very significant that just the names of those two pieces of legislation speak volumes. In the 1990s, it was about disability services. We then, in the mid-2000s, have the United Nations Charter for People with Disability. And in 2014, we introduced the Disability Inclusion Act. So our mindset and our approach is not so much how do we provide services, but actually how do we build a genuinely inclusive community. And that's the heart of the message. That is the Australia that we are all working towards. And that's why I think speaking on this subject here at Affinity is so rich, because Affinity is about building an inclusive Australia as well. And if we can build an Australia which is inclusive for people with disability, we can do so in every dimension, whether it's racial or religious or language or any other dimension. Because our future, and the future which all of us as Australians want to work towards, is an Australia where we are genuinely inclusive, because that's an Australian future. That's a future which we can all be deeply, deeply proud of. And the National Disability Insurance Scheme is one major way of us achieving that. Thank you very much.